This is the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. In this episode, we continue our celebration of Anthony Burgess's poetry by interviewing Jonathan Mann, the editor of Burgess's collected poems. This collection brings previously unpublished poems into print and re-examines many of the poems found in Burgess's novels. It also includes Burgess's long-form poems such as Moses, a retelling of the biblical story which has been out of print for over 40 years. Jonathan Mann is a teacher, editor, researcher, poet and musician. He completed a PhD in the poetry of Anthony Burgess and has published widely on Burgess's writing. Jonathan is also curator of poetry through the Capital Letters Live Poetry series. Collected Poems by Anthony Burgess is published by Carcanet and is out now.
It's a pleasure to have Jonathan Mann down the line. Jonathan, you're the editor of this magnificent 500-page collection of Burgess's poems, the first complete selection or collection of his work that we've had. Maybe as a first question, you could tell us something about how your work began on Burgess and his poetry.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to be discussing this project with you. I think it's fair to say that the project began as a scholarly project. It actually goes back to about 1999 or 2000 when it seemed appropriate for me to collate some of the existing poems from many of the novels, especially the Enderby novels. I just had a scholarly interest in the poems as they're published in those novels. So it was just really something I used and brought together so that I could study and understand the poems. And in the process of doing so, I realized that there's a sort of a hidden series of texts, although they're not so hidden within the novels. So I ended up with a collection of something like maybe 50 to 100 poems, because at the time I was writing on Burgess's poetry, and I was investigating Burgess as a poet for the first time, most especially in connection with the Enderby novels. So yeah, I put together a very small collection for my own purposes, so that I could read the poems in context as poems that were divorced from their settings in the novel. And in the process of doing so, it became clear to me that the poems themselves exist in a very cohesive way and can be read on their own terms, most especially in relation to Burgess's contemporaries. And I became very interested in who Burgess was reading as a poet, and I became very interested in where these strange and wonderful and highly and tightly written pieces were coming from.
Okay, let me take you back to the beginnings of the Burgess Foundation. I understand that you met Liana Burgess must have been 2004, and proposed the book to her. And that's an interesting story, and it would be good to know more about that.
I gave a talk at a Burgess Foundation event in Liverpool some time ago, and my talk was about Burgess and his poetry, and I was reading Burgess as a modernist poet, and I delivered this talk, and at the front was a woman who was looking very kindly towards me, and I sort of half recognised her, and so in the course of completing the speech, I got some very kind feedback from this person, and yes, it was Liana Burgess, and she said to me that she thought Anthony would have enjoyed my talk, which was something that gave me a great deal of personal pleasure. And through that meeting, I was introduced to Alan Ruffley, the original director of the Burgess Foundation, and then to you, Andrew, and our scholarly relationship built up from there. But I also was in touch with Liana a few times she gave me permission to work with some unpublished work, and she was extraordinarily supportive of the enterprise, and I found it a real privilege to be working with Liana and to have that very kind support from her.
It's very interesting what you say about the way that Burgess valued his poetry and Liana's suggestion that he might have enjoyed the idea of it being collected, because it seems to me that throughout his life there's a very ambiguous relationship between the writing of narrative prose fiction and the writing of poetry. Almost an embarrassment about it, maybe, in that he's often smuggling poetry into the novels. And yet it wasn't until he was more than halfway through his career, I suppose, with the novel ABBA, ABBA, where he finally sort of came out and presented poems, just as that, because prior to that, they'd been there in the Enderby novels, but within the frame of a fiction. And I suppose you've still got that frame in the ABBA novel. So, all right, there is a question here. I wonder if you could tell us about how Burgess came to poetry and why he didn't persist with it. Why, after his earliest poems were published, he then went away and did other things, and maybe how he came back to it later on.
I would say Burgess did pursue his poetry, and we can track its course throughout his career. And that begins, as I said, with these short-form modernist experimentations in the 1930s, persisting through into the 1950s with the works that you've spoken about, which are included in his novels. And then in the 70s, he became a much more expansive, long-form writer. 1973 and 1974 especially being high points of his productivity as a long-form poet. And then in the 80s, there was more experimentation, more poems being written, and then ending in the 90s with Burn.
Jonathan, the work in this book, it's very varied. There are different kinds of poetry that we find here. Very briefly, for people who don't know the work, could you sum up what they can expect from the Burgess collected poems?
I think they can expect some very expansive poems that are very adventurous, poems that seek to tackle very wide-ranging themes and a diversity of themes. And I think readers will see formal experimentation. So you'll see a different almost each page offers a different type of poetry, and it offers a different type of form. And readers will be able to see the multiplicity of styles and techniques and linguistic innovations that is present within Burgess's poetry.
Let me ask you about your research journey. Tell me where you went. Where did you find the manuscripts and typescripts that have gone into this book?
The manuscripts and typescripts that went into this book come from two main sources, two main archives. The archive that I think we should mention most is the archive in the International Anthony Burgess Foundation, because that archive, especially at the time when I was researching this book, was still producing new material, and new material kept emerging. So in many respects, I felt as though I was working at the forefront of the archive's discoveries, and there was a very good partnership with the archivists there. And the material that came from the foundation was paper manuscripts, and but also lurking within flyleaves of books there and matchbooks and things like that. There was poetry to be discovered, and some things were catalogued and some things were not, and that was a really exciting process. Another archive that features in this work, or where the work comes from, is the Harry Ransom archive at the University of Texas in Austin, which has a very extensive collection of letters and draft novels and draft plays and miscellaneous collections of manuscripts. And those were inspected too, and that yielded well for me.
So, who are the poets who influenced Burgess? I mean, when he's starting off in the 20s and 30s, I suppose, as a reader, which are the poets who are really making a mark on him, do you think?
Well, I think the key one early in his career was Hopkins. As I said before, he began his career as a writer echoing Hopkins. Empson um, was also a strong influence, especially early on. And we see that in things like the Revolutionary Sonnets. In terms of linguistic sound effects, Burgess followed Hopkins. In terms of form, I think, and some content, I think we hear Empson. But in terms of the way that Burgess responds to other poets and the way that Burgess uses mythic things like mythic devices, or the way that he's interpreting history, especially ancient history, and bringing it back into more modern forms. I think Burgess takes a lot from Eliot.
At this point, we might ask Burgess to join the conversation. We've got a recording of him reading some of his favourite poems here.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousin's, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust.
The longest poem in the book is Moses, the epic poem, really, written in conjunction with the Moses television series in the 1970s. Now, most readers won't know this poem. It's been out of print for more than 40 years. Tell us what kinds of writing we find in Moses.
Burgess, in his preface, doesn't acknowledge it as a poem. He says it's a treatment. He says he used the form to contain the enormity of the subject. And the epic form that he's chosen, the very ancient, traditional epic form that he's chosen, is in many respects well suited for the biblical language and the biblical action and the biblical narrative, of course, highly biblical narrative of Moses.
I wanted to ask you about some of the political poems which are in the book as well. For example, O Lord, O Ford, God Help Us, Also You, which is a reflection on the American presidency, very timely. Also, the essay on censorship, which was written in the wake of the Rushdie affair in 1989. Do you think people will be surprised to discover that Burgess was also such a political writer?
Well, some of the writings that Burgess is most famous for, and of course thinking about A Clockwork Orange or Earthly Powers, are in themselves quite political books. Burgess was somebody who experienced the end of the British Empire and the collapse of the empire. He had colonial experience as a teacher in Malaya. He also participated in the Second World War, and he then saw the way that the post-war world was changing, and that was reflected in novels like Tremor of Intent. So other works are political in theme, if not in intent. For example, in The Wanting Seed, he talks about overpopulation and talks about food supply, and in 1984 is tackling trade unionism, and in A Clockwork Orange, he's talking about criminality and the policies and politics around that. And in Tremor of Intent, he writes about the Cold War and the ethics of brinkmanship. And in Earthly Powers, Burgess goes to great lengths to pass comment on Nazism and the Holocaust and where we go from there. So I think if you read the novels in that kind of context, it's not so surprising that political commentary finds its way into the poems.
I think there is something quite peculiar about the Ford poem, Gerald Ford, in that it was published on the opinion pages of the New York Times at the end of 1974 with a big cartoon by Ralph Steadman. I was trying to think which living poet would get that kind of exposure, would get 2 pages, broadsheet pages in the New York Times with a Steadman cartoon to write a poem about the State of the Union. And of course, he's not even American. I have no idea who commissioned this, but part of the surprise is to think about how that poem came about, and also the confidence of Burgess kind of rising to the challenge, I suppose.
I think Burgess always had the confidence to be able to pass comment. He was a journalist as well, so he was very connected to contemporary debates, political or otherwise. And that poem can stand alongside other poems that are about radically different subjects, but also poems written about substantial, expansive concepts.
Burgess described himself sometimes as a novelist who was a failed musician. And it's also worth remembering he never claimed the title of poet for himself in his lifetime. And with all of that having been said, I wonder how seriously did he take his poetry? How seriously should we take it?
Burgess, as I said, wanted to be published. And he was serious enough to write reams of this stuff. He produced a great deal of poetry, and the manuscripts I inspected suggested that he was writing poetry in between everything else. So he might have spent the day writing his famous 1,000 words before breakfast, then maybe he'll write a sonnet, and then perhaps we'll have a sonata for lunch, and then back to prose in the afternoon. I think Burgess was writing poetry as part of his ongoing practice as an artist. And I think if Burgess didn't regard himself as a poet, he wouldn't have gone through what must have been a huge amount of agony and labour in producing these very long, these very expansive, long-form, experimentalist, but formalist poems.
It's interesting to think about the discipline of writing poems alongside writing so much else. And one of the things Paul Howard demonstrated in his work on the Belly manuscripts was that he really did write a poem or a translation of a poem every day at one period in the 1970s. That's kind of interesting if we want to think about Burgess, keeping going and keeping the work coming out. As we've been speaking, it seems to me that there's a comparison to be drawn between what he's doing with his poetry and what he does with his music, because the range and the formal variety of the music finds its parallel in his poetic output, it seems to me. Anyway, all of that's a prelude to asking you, what are your favourite poems in this book, and what do you think are the best poems in the collected poems?
Well, I'm going to sidestep the question because I don't really want to suggest I have a favourite poem, although I might, but that's going to stay secret. But there is a poem that I want to bring to people's attention, which is, in my view, a very unusual poem, and seemingly out of step with much of the other material. And that's a strange poem called Nostalgia in Head Plunging. And it's not my favourite poem, but I think it's the most interesting poem. It's a very undeveloped poem. I don't think it was ever designed for publication, really. It's a piece of experimental writing that I don't think was intended for publication. I think it's a very personal piece of writing, but it's unusually direct, and it intervenes with debates about what poetry is.
What do you think is new in this book, Jonathan? And what aspects of Burgess that we didn't know about before can we begin to see through these collected poems?
I think the new thing we see is the sheer scale of the enterprise, because it's now presented on its own terms. And we see how adventurous Burgess was as a poet of multiple forms, as a long form poet. I think we also see Burgess as highly experimental. I think the experimentalism that he's famous for in novels such as A Clockwork Orange can be seen here. And I think because this is, as it were, closer to his source material for the linguistic experimentalism, and I'm talking about Hopkins, Auden, Pound, Empson, because it's closer to that, I think we see new ways of understanding Burgess's linguistic experimentalism. So I think that's a key way of looking at Burgess anew.
Jonathan, thank you very much. You've opened the door on the range and variety of Burgess's poetic work, and I'm sure this book is going to delight many readers. It certainly deserves to. So to play us out, here's a recording of Burgess reading from one of his favourite poets. This is Edith Sitwell, a piece from her Facade.
When Walton wrote music, which was rather witty parody of popular dance forms and popular songs, in a sense affirming that here is the reality. The reality is here, in the music. These are dances, these are songs, we know where we stand. There's no adventure here. The adventure, the setting free, which is normally left to music, was in fact left to the words. You remember this particular poem, when Sir Beelzebub called for his syllabub in the hotel in hell, blue as the waves of the sea, with the gendarmerie rocking and shocking the barmaid. Nobody comes to give him his rum, but the rim of the sky, hippopotamus glum, enhances the chances to bless with a benison Alfred Lord Tennyson crossing the bar laid with pale vegetation of pale deputations of temperance workers, all sign in memoriam, hoping in glory to trip up the laureate's feet, moving in classical meters. Like Balaclava, the lava came down from the roof, and the sea's blue wooden gendarmerie took him in charge while Beelzebub calls for his rum. None of them come. There's a word for that, and the word is surrealism.
You've been listening to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation podcast. Collected poems by Anthony Burgess, edited by Jonathan Mann and published by Carcanet, is available now from your favourite place to buy books. For more information on Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit www.anthonyburgess.org.